Hi everyone, I'm Biz. Today I want to go over a common but somewhat challenging task when it comes to data processing, and that is cleaning up messy data before you can analyze or do anything else with it. So for this example, I will be using salary survey data from US managers in various industries. I have pushed the CSV file and the code for this exercise to my GitHub account so you can download it and follow along. Before we get started, let's take a look at the data in Google Sheets. So this shows survey data across multiple variables. There's 17 columns, so there's 17 variables, and each of them is about an attribute of the respondents, their age, education, title, salary, location, level of education, gender, and so on. Several of these columns are free-form responses. For the sake of convenience, let's take a look at the city and state columns. These two columns have not been standardized. Some of the rows are missing the state, and some have been lumped along with the city in this city column. Now, let's say we want to aggregate the number of responses by city and state. If we want to accomplish that one task, we would have to go through the file and cleanse the data so that our aggregation can succeed. But before we actually can write any code, let's come up with the steps we need to get the final output. So in this part of the exercise, I would like you to pause the video for 5 minutes and write down exactly how you would do it. Think about how you would go from having a raw file that you just downloaded, which is this file that we're looking at, to getting the clean output. Welcome back. Now let's go over the steps and see how well yours compare to mine. As you can see, I have come up with 5 high-level steps that we need to perform. So how well do yours compare to this? Are they more in depth, less in depth, or about the same? I ask this because there is a cost associated with each of these approaches. For example, if it's more in depth, you might have made the steps more complicated than you need to, which might make it hard to implement the solution. But if they're less in depth, then maybe you're omitting some essential steps. This is a problem because when you're coding, how would you know what you should do next? So in order to avoid these pitfalls, try to think of the essential high-level steps that we need to follow. Once we have these high-level steps, we can dig a bit deeper into each step. But before we can actually start digging deeper, let's look at these steps. The first step says open the file and then convert the file into a CSV, then go through each row in the CSV. Then if the row has a malformed city and state pair, fix it, and after going through all the rows, save the data as a new file. So this is the high level set of steps. In order to think about the more detailed in-depth steps, think of which step here is the most critical one. The first 3 are somewhat simple because we're not going to be writing our own implementation to actually do the conversion of CSV or anything. But the one that we actually need to implement ourselves is number 4. For that, I have these steps. So let's say we said fix them, right? Fix the malformed rows. Now, for each row, what we need to do is inspect each column, and then if the column is for a state, check that the state is not empty. And then if the state is empty, remember this is an option, this is a problem that we already discussed, which is that if the state is not empty, we do nothing. But if the state is empty, check that the city column has 2 values separated by a comma. This is true here, the city with state separated by a column. And then we need to split these values along the comma and treat the first part as the city and the second part as the state. We split it here along the comma for Boston, Massachusetts. Boston becomes the city, Massachusetts becomes the state. I've thought of an additional step here. I'm going to call this optional. If the state is abbreviated, let's say replace with the full state name. But this is really not essential because the act of replacing it is just doing another lookup for the full name. The real challenge is actually finding out where this needs to happen. And so we would have done 95% of the work by the time we get here. So we're actually not going to do this optional step. Instead, we'll just move on to finalizing of the assignments. Assign the values to their respective columns, and that's it. That's a lot of discussion. So now let's get started with the code. I'm using Sublime, and on the right side I have my terminal. Okay, so the first thing I will do is I will save this file. Okay, it's been saved. We can see it here. It's on the right side, and I will turn this into a comment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to need to import CSV, and in the CSV, the first statement that we need to write is a statement to open the file. So the way we open a file is, let's start IPython, and then I'll go inside IPython imports CSV. Let's call this rows. Rows equals an empty list, and then we'll open salary survey, the CSV as f data equals CSV the dict reader f. For each row in data, we want to add that row to the rows list. So now if we look at what's at the 0th index, so this shows us the very first row in the CSV file. The header is on the left side. It's the first element. Let's actually copy this to the script. Okay, this basically open the file. This covers two things, and now we need to go through step 3, which is go through each row in the CSV. Now, the way we go through each row is, we can just write it here. For row in rows, let's see, if not, let's bring this comment up. If the row has a malformed city and state pair, fix it. So the way we check that is if not row.get state. That means if the row is empty. What we want to do is we want to look at the city column. So we'll call this a pair, and then row.get city. Now we assume this is a pair, and what we will do with that pair is we will split it, comma, and assume that there are two values in here. And the way we will validate that is if the length of pair is 2, and if the length of the first item in the pair is greater than 0, and if the length of the second item in the pair is greater than 0, then that means we have a valid pair of a city and state. But it's not necessarily a city and state. It could be a city and a country, or a state and a country. So in that case, what we will say is that state, let's say city equals pair 0 is the first item, and state equals pair 1. What did we say in the comments? So let's take this up for each row. Inspect each column. I'm just trying to align everything with the comments. If the column is for a state, check that the state is not empty. If the state is empty, so the state is empty when we get down here, this is the validation part, and then split the values and treat the first as the city part. Okay, we've also done this. Let me move this up. Obviously, we're not gonna do the optional part right now, so we'll move it down here. So the next step is assign. Let's comment this in. assign the values to their respective columns. The way we do that is row state equals state and row city equals city. After that, we're good. We don't have to do anything else here because this modifies the row which is inside rows in place. Now, after this, save the data as a new file. This number 5 is our next step. So the way we're going to save this is we're going to say with open clean.csv, this is how we create a new file. And this file is for writing, and we're going to create a reference to it with an F. And then what we're going to say is field names. Field names are the rows. We'll just take it from the very first item. And then it has the reference to the file, and field names is equal to field names. It's expecting the column headers. And then we're going to write, after writing headers, we're going to write all the rows. Writer, the write rows. And then we're just going to pass the rows. And then we'll click save. Now let's exit in IPython. Let's exit IPython. Clear. So I'm going to list the files inside. I think that's it. We just have to execute as python 3 salary survey.py. Object has no attribute write headers. So it must be write header then. Okay, I saved it. Okay, it ran, and if we do this, ls, it has clean.csv. Clean.csv, let's look at the contents of it a little bit. Less clean.csv. Okay, we can see that there's some output. Now let's open this in Google Sheets and compare it to the original one. Okay. Clean. Okay. So this is the new version. So let's look at the first line. The first line was always, I think, Boston, Massachusetts properly populated. But if we go down to row 12, we see that state is now MA, city is Boston. But if we look at the original unmodified one, it's Boston, comma, MA. We can find another example. Okay, this follows the same pattern as well. The state column is empty, but the city column has 2 values, although Newcastle and UK don't follow city-state convention. That was row 95. If you look at row 95, Newcastle and UK. So we were able to go through the steps that we've come up with and essentially wrote code that does exactly what each set of steps states. So my question to you would be, how would you do this? Given this, how can we modify it to do this next task? And on top of that, how could we modify other columns that need to be fixed as well? So I will leave that to you as an exercise. And thank you for watching.